Winter arrives early in the north, and when it comes, it does not announce itself with drama. There is no sudden storm, no sharp dividing line between before and after. Instead, the light changes first. The sun begins to rise lower in the sky, tracing a shallow arc that never quite climbs. Shadows stretch longer across the ground. Midday feels brief, almost tentative, as if the daylight itself is unsure how long it is allowed to stay. The land notices this before people do. The soil cools and hardens. Water lingers longer in shallow pools, then holds still beneath a thin skin of ice. Wind moving in from the sea carries a different weight, heavier, drier, stripping warmth from anything it touches. By late autumn, the nights lengthen enough that darkness becomes familiar. It settles in early and leaves late, lingering at the edges of the day. In this place, winter is not a season you pass through quickly. It is something you live inside for months at a time. The northern landscape does not offer much protection. Trees grow slowly and sparsely. The ground is uneven, shaped by rock, peat, and old ice. Snow does not fall gently here. It is carried sideways by wind, driven into corners and against walls, packed tight into drifts that harden into something closer to stone than powder. When temperatures drop, they stay low. Cold becomes constant, not a momentary discomfort, but a background condition present in every breath and every surface. This is the environment that sets the rules. There is little mercy in it. The cold does not adapt to human needs. It does not ease because someone is tired or unprepared. It simply persists. Heat once lost must be rebuilt slowly. Energy wasted during the day cannot be recovered at night. Mistakes compound. A poor decision made in the afternoon will make itself known hours later when the sun is gone and the wind has nowhere left to go but through skin and bone. For the people who lived here, winter was not an interruption to life, it was life. Daily rhythms formed around its presence. Time was measured less by dates and more by light. Work expanded and contracted with the sun's weak reach across the sky. Tasks that required dexterity and movement were done early, while fingers still bent easily and breath did not sting. As the light faded, activity narrowed. The world outside grew quieter, not because it was peaceful, but because moving in the cold required intention. Nothing in this environment encouraged excess. The land rewarded those who understood its limits. It favored planning over reaction, routine over improvisation. Warmth was never guaranteed. It had to be gathered, protected, and shared. Shelter could not be temporary or fragile. It had to endure long stretches of cold and darkness without demanding constant repair. Food had to last. Fuel had to burn slowly. Bodies had to conserve energy, not expend it. Here, survival did not come from strength alone, it came from alignment. The shape of the land influenced the shape of life. Low hills offered modest protection from wind. Earth could be cut and stacked. Timber, when available, had to be used carefully. Every material carried a cost, measured in effort and time. Nothing could be wasted without consequence. Even light itself felt like a resource, something to be used while it was present and accepted when it was gone. As winter deepened, the environment simplified. Colors drained away until the world settled into shades of white, gray, and dark brown. Sound changed too. Snow absorbed noise. Wind became the dominant voice, rising and falling, shaping the hours. At night, when clouds parted, stars appeared sharp and numerous, unsoftened by warmth or haze. The sky felt close, heavy with cold. In these conditions, the body learned quickly. It learned how cold crept inward from the ground. It learned how exposed skin reacted within moments. It learned that rest was not separate from survival, but part of it. Sleep was not a luxury granted after comfort was achieved. It was something that had to be made possible night after night through careful choices long before darkness arrived. The North did not offer second chances easily. A fire allowed to fade too far became difficult to revive. Wet clothing stayed wet, poorly stored food spoiled. Gaps in shelter admitted wind that could not be negotiated with once it arrived. The land kept score quietly without judgment, recording every oversight. And yet, within these limits, life persisted. People adapted not by resisting the cold, but by organizing themselves around it. They accepted that winter would dominate the calendar and shaped their days accordingly. They learned when to stop working outside, when to turn inward, when to gather close. The rhythm of the year slowed as the rhythm of the day shortened. Activity condensed, focus narrowed. What mattered was continuity. Each night survived made the next one possible. Each morning brought a small extension of light, a brief opportunity to prepare again. The goal was not to defeat winter or escape it, but to remain steady within it, to pass through long nights without losing warmth, without losing strength, without losing one another. This is where the story begins, not with individuals and not with heroic acts, but with a place and the conditions it imposed, a landscape that demanded respect and rewarded understanding, a winter that shaped every aspect of daily life, from how people worked to how they rested. Before there are homes, before there are fires, before there is sleep, there is the land itself setting the terms. Everything that follows unfolds within those terms, slowly, deliberately, as the light fades and the long night draws closer. Morning in the far north did not arrive like a curtain pulled open. It seeped in slowly, diluted, as if the sun had to negotiate with the horizon before it was allowed to show itself. The light that finally appeared was pale and low, skimming across snowfields and dark ground with little warmth. It did not flood the world, it merely outlined it. Inside the longhouse, the first signs of waking were small and practical. A shift of weight on a sleeping platform, a blanket lifted and resettled, a quiet exhale that turned into a thin cloud in the cooler air near the floor, then vanished. The long house held warmth better than the open world, but not perfectly. During the deepest winter, even indoors, cold lived in layers, heaviest at ground level, lighter higher up, gathering under the roof timbers, where smoke had stained everything black over years. Someone woke first, not because they felt refreshed, but because their body sensed what needed doing. They sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the sleepers beside them. The platform creaked under the shift. The air immediately touched their cheeks and hands, cool and dry. Their fingers flexed once, twice, as if asking the joints to cooperate. The fire at the center of the hall was no roaring blaze, not yet. It was a patient bed of coals, dim and red under a thin skin of ash. Even that faint heat changed the space. It created a gentle gradient, warmer closer to the hearth, cooler along the walls. The person who rose first moved toward it with the quiet certainty of routine. Bare feet did not meet bare ground. There were layers, straw, hides, woven cloth, anything that broke the direct contact with the earth. Still, the cold underneath pressed upward in its own slow way. They crouched near the hearth and held out their hands over the coals, palms down, then turned them palms up. The warmth was modest but immediate, like sunlight through a thin window. They breathed in and smelled the familiar mix of smoke, wool, and dried grass. It was not unpleasant, it was the scent of endurance. With an iron tool or a simple stick hardened by fire, they stirred the ash carefully, revealing brighter coals beneath. A faint hiss rose as oxygen reached the heat again. They did not add fuel in a hurry. Fuel was not infinite. A fire was managed the way water was managed, or food, a little at the right time to keep it alive. A few pieces of dried fuel, turf, peat, or carefully saved wood were placed with gaps between them. The spacing mattered. Too tight and the fire would smother, too loose and it would not catch. They watched for the smallest change, a darker edge warming, a thin ribbon of smoke curling up, the first weak flame licking along a corner. The long house brightened by degrees, not in a dramatic flare, but in a slow return to function. As the fire steadied, the rest of the household began to shift. One by one, sleepers stirred, rolling shoulders, pulling garments closer, bringing hands to mouths, to warm breath before speaking. Voices were quiet in the morning, not out of reverence, but because there was no reason for loudness. The day was short, efficiency mattered more than noise. At the far end of the longhouse, behind a low partition, livestock breathed in the dimness. Their presence was not symbolic, it was physical. Warmth rose from them in a slow, constant flow, the way steam rises from wet stone. A cow shifted its weight, a sheep rustled hay, a goat made a soft sound that belonged to no human word. The noises blended with the quiet crackle of the revived fire, creating a steady background that made the longhouse feel inhabited even before anyone spoke. Someone checked the animals first, not with affection, not with ceremony, but with the practical attention reserved for living resources. A quick glance over the barrier, a count made without counting aloud. The animals were there, they were breathing, they were not stiff with cold. That was enough. Then came the smallest work of the morning, separating what needed doing inside from what needed doing outside. Inside, tasks were slow and close to the fire, a pot set near the heat, a handful of grain measured out with fingers that already knew the amount, a skin bag opened and closed again, a piece of cloth mended with a few careful stitches, a knife edge tested lightly against a thumb, wool drawn through hands in a familiar rhythm. These motions did not require bright light, they required steadiness. Outside, the world waited with its own demands. The door of the longhouse was low, made to hold heat, made to discourage the wind from sweeping in uninvited. When it opened, the change in temperature was immediate. Cold did not drift in, it entered like a presence. A narrow slice of pale daylight cut into the smoky interior, and for a moment the air seemed to shift in response. The person who stepped out did so already layered, already prepared. The cold met their face, and the body reacted in small ways, shoulders tightening, breath shortening, nostrils stinging. The ground underfoot was hard, the snow packed by earlier footsteps and by wind. Even sound changed outdoors. The world was quieter, not because it was calm, but because snow swallowed noise and cold made everything feel distant. They did not linger. Outside work was done quickly in winter. Water had to be checked. Anything that could freeze would freeze. Tools left exposed became harder to handle. Wood, if there was wood, had to be carried and stored where it would stay dry. If there was peat, it was stacked where it could be reached without effort when darkness returned. The sun, low as it was, offered little warmth, but it offered something else: time. A few hours when visibility was enough to move with purpose, to see the edge of a path, the outline of a structure, the place where wind had piled snow higher than yesterday. People measured winter days in actions completed before the light failed. Back inside, the fire remained the center. It was tended, not worshipped. Someone fed it another piece of fuel and watched the smoke rising toward the roof opening. A slight adjustment made with a pole changed how the smoke moved, how it escaped, how fresh air entered, how steady the draw remained. It was a quiet form of engineering, learned by observation, refined by repetition. The longhouse warmed gradually, not to comfort, not to anything resembling modern ease, but to a workable state. Fingers loosened, knees bent more easily. The air near the platforms became less biting. People worked without rushing, but without wasting motion. The day was always shorter than it seemed, and the cold always returned before anyone felt ready. Food was prepared in a way that did not demand excess heat. A stew thickened slowly. A piece of preserved meat softened near the fire. A small portion was shared first with those who needed it most: children, the elderly, anyone who had woken stiff and slow. Warmth from inside the body mattered. A hot mouthful changed the way the cold was felt. Outside, the sun climbed only slightly, then began its slow decline almost as soon as it had appeared. The light never became bright. It remained a thin wash across the landscape. The long house did not rely on daylight anyway. It relied on firelight and on the habit of living in dimness. By midday, if it could be called that, the household had settled into its winter pattern: work close to the hearth, movement measured, the door opening only when necessary. Each time it opened, a reminder came in: cold air, a brief flare of pale light, the sting of wind. Each time it closed, the interior reclaimed its muffled, smoky calm. In this place, nothing was dramatic. Survival did not announce itself. It was hidden in small decisions repeated every day: how much fuel to burn, how long to stay outside, how close to sit to the fire, how carefully to keep clothing dry, how quietly to preserve energy. The day did not feel heroic, it felt ordinary, and that ordinary rhythm was the point. The sun continued its shallow path. The light began to thin again, almost before anyone had finished what they meant to do. The longhouse, already dim, seemed to draw inward, as if it knew what was coming. People glanced toward the door less often. Tools were gathered closer. Tasks that could wait were allowed to wait. There were always tasks that could wait, and winter taught the difference between what mattered and what merely filled time. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, tracing along the walls, testing for gaps. Snow lifted and settled again, whispering across the ground. Inside, the fire held steady, and the household adjusted without speaking much about it, each person already sensing the turn of the day toward evening. The afternoon did not arrive with a feeling of progress, it arrived with a feeling of loss. The light that had never been generous began to recede, slipping away from the world as if pulled by an unseen tide. Shadows deepened in corners. The horizon grew flatter. The cold outside thickened, and the air seemed to sharpen as though every breath had edges. Inside the long house, this change was noticed without anyone naming it. People moved slightly closer to the hearth. The work that required more precision was finished first. Hands that needed to tie, mend, carve, or stitch did so, while the light, thin as it was, still supported the eyes. Then those tools were put away, not thrown aside, not abandoned, but placed where they could be found again in dim firelight. There was a certain economy to these movements. Everything had a place, not because the household was tidy in any modern sense, but because disorder cost time, and time cost warmth. Searching for a tool meant standing longer in cooler air. Spilling grain meant hunger later. Forgetting a bundle of fuel outside meant making an unnecessary trip into the wind after dark. Winter punished small waste. The longhouse itself seemed to change as evening approached. The air grew more still. Smoke settled a little lower beneath the roof. The light from the fire became more dominant, turning faces into warm shapes surrounded by shadow. Beyond the fire's reach, the walls held onto their quiet darkness, thick and unyielding. The hearth was checked again, more deliberately now. Someone leaned in close and studied the coals the way a person might study the surface of water before crossing. Ash was shifted. A few new pieces of fuel were placed with care, not to create a sudden blaze, but to build a reserve of steady heat that could last through the first deep hours of night. The fire did not have to be dramatic, it had to be reliable. Near the partition, the animals were fed again. Hay was carried and scattered where it could be reached without conflict. The sound of chewing rose, rhythmic and steady, a kind of slow percussion under the day's fading light. The warmth they produced was constant, almost unnoticed until it was imagined absent. A cow exhaled and the breath drifted in the dimness. A sheep shifted, hooves scraping softly against packed earth. The living and the animal space were not two separate worlds. Heat and air moved between them. Even sound moved between them. Clothing was adjusted in small, habitual ways. A cloak pulled tighter over shoulders. A strip of cloth wrapped once more around a wrist. A damp corner of fabric turned inward toward the body where it could be warmed and dried slowly. Moisture was a quiet enemy. It stole heat without announcing itself. A person could sit close to a fire and still feel cold if their clothing held dampness from the outside. So garments were shaken out. Snow was brushed away. Boots were placed near heat, not too close, not close enough to damage leather, but close enough that stiffness would ease by morning. Food work shifted too. The evening meal was not a feast, it was a preparation. People in cold climates understood something without saying it aloud. Going to sleep hungry was dangerous. Warmth could not be held by willpower. It was held by the body's steady internal work, and that work required fuel. A pot simmered. The smell of salted meat and grain rose into the smoky air. A ladle moved in slow circles. The surface of the stew thickened and settled, thick enough to cling. Someone tasted it, not for pleasure, but for salt, for the balance that would make it sustaining. A wooden bowl was set out, another, then another. Portions were measured without measuring. There was no need to speak about fairness. Fairness lived in the routine. People ate close to the fire. Hands warmed around bowls. Steam rose and touched cheeks. For a moment the body felt a small relief. Heat in the mouth, warmth in the chest. The cold did not disappear. It simply moved farther away. As the meal ended, activity narrowed further. The long house began to resemble what it would be for most of the coming hours. a low-lit interior shaped around heat. The space near the hearth remained active. The edges became still. Children were guided toward the sleeping platforms earlier than the adults, their movements less controlled, their warmth more quickly lost. They were wrapped, adjusted, tucked in beside older bodies that would act as another kind of insulation. The preparations for sleep were not a single moment. They were a series of small acts repeated in the same order each evening. Bedding was shaken out, furs were spread, coarse blankets were layered, not for softness but for trapped air. The platform itself, raised above the floor, mattered now more than it had during the day. Cold air sank. The lowest layer of air close to the ground held the deepest chill. Sleeping above that layer was not comfort, it was strategy. Someone checked the doorway again. The latch was firm. Any gap was blocked with cloth or straw or whatever could slow the wind. The longhouse did not aim for perfect ceiling. Perfect ceiling was difficult. It aimed for enough, enough to keep the worst of the drafts from cutting through the living space, enough to keep the fire from being stolen by sudden gusts. Outside, the light faded into something that was barely light at all. The landscape lost detail. Snowfields became a single pale surface. Trees, if there were trees, became silhouettes. The sky darkened, not quickly but inevitably. The cold deepened with each degree of fading brightness. Wind moved along the ground, lifting loose snow in thin sheets that slid across the surface like smoke. Inside, the firelight now did most of the seeing. Faces were illuminated from below, gentle and tired. The air held warmth close to the hearth, while farther away the cold was still present, patient, waiting. People shifted their bodies toward the heat as if drawn by gravity. The last tasks of the day were small. A container was closed. A tool was set in its place. A piece of food was tucked away. Someone spoke softly to someone else, not to exchange important information, but to keep a thread of human sound moving through the space. Then even that faded. Conversation was not the point of evening, rest was. The fire was adjusted once more, a final careful tending. Not too much fuel, not too little. The kind of fuel that would burn slowly, that would hold coals through the night. The person responsible for the fire, whether it was a designated role or simply whoever had the habit, watched the flame's behavior. They watched the way smoke moved toward the roof opening. They listened to the crackle. They learned the fire the way a sailor learns wind. The longhouse settled. Bodies moved onto the platforms in the order that felt natural. Those who needed more warmth were placed nearer the hearth. Those who were used to the cold took the edges. Furs covered legs and shoulders. Blankets were pulled up to chins. The air close to skin warmed in small pockets. The rest of the space remained cool but less threatening now, because the night had been prepared for. Breathing slowed. The sounds of the animals softened as they lay down, heavy bodies sinking into straw. A cow exhaled in a long, steady rhythm that could be felt as much as heard. The fire's crackle became a steady pulse. The longhouse did not become silent, it became consistent. Outside, darkness was complete. The wind continued its slow movement around the structure, testing it, circling it. Snow pressed against the walls in quiet drifts. The cold waited beyond the barrier of earth and timber. Inside, the household remained in the shallow center of warmth it had built for itself through the day. Nothing in this moment felt like an ending. It felt like a shift into another kind of time, slower, narrower, measured in coals and breath and the careful persistence of heat. The night did not begin with a dramatic change. It began with the long house drawing in around the fire and the human world becoming smaller and closer and more quietly determined to endure the hours ahead. The long house was not experienced all at once. It revealed itself gradually through sensation rather than sight. Its shape was felt in how the air moved, how sound traveled, how warmth lingered or faded depending on where a body rested. From the outside, it was a low structure pressed into the land, its roofline modest against the sky. From the inside, it was an enclosure that held people, animals, heat, and time together under one weighty ceiling. The walls were thick, built not for elegance but for endurance. Layers of earth and turf pressed together, roots still woven through the soil, creating a dense barrier that resisted the cold by slowing it. Cold did not rush through these walls. It seeped slowly, the way dampness seeps through stone. This slowness mattered. It gave the people inside time to respond, time to build warmth before it was lost. Standing near a wall, a person could feel the difference. The air was cooler there, heavier, as if it had settled against the earth itself. Moving away from the wall toward the center of the long house, the temperature changed subtly. It was never warm in a modern sense, but it was workable. The difference between discomfort and danger was measured in degrees, and the long house existed to protect that difference. The roof rose overhead in a shallow curve, supported by wooden posts darkened by years of smoke. Those posts were not decorative. They were load bearing, holding up a roof that carried snow, wind, and the weight of winter storms without complaint. Between the roof timbers, the ceiling was not sealed tightly. It allowed smoke to gather and drift toward openings above, creating a layered interior where the highest air was thick and dark and the lowest air remained clearer. This vertical layering was not an accident. Warm air rose, smoke rose, cold air sank. The longhouse accepted this and worked with it. People lived and slept above the coldest layer, on raised platforms that lifted them away from the ground. The fire stayed low, its heat spreading outward before rising. Everything followed the same quiet logic. The floor itself was packed earth, covered with straw, hides, and whatever else could break the contact between body and ground. The ground was always cold. No amount of fire could change that entirely, but distance helped. Even a small separation slowed the transfer of cold into feet, legs, backs. People knew this without needing to explain it. They felt it the moment they stood or sat in the wrong place for too long. Sound behaved differently inside the longhouse. Voices did not echo. They softened quickly, absorbed by earth fabric bodies. A cough near the fire was heard clearly. A movement near the wall was muted. The longhouse kept its own counsel. It held noise close, the way it held heat. During the day, the space was flexible. People worked where there was light, where there was warmth, shifting positions as needed. But as evening approached, the longhouse began to narrow its focus. The useful area shrank toward the hearth. The rest of the space receded into shadow, still present, but less active. This contraction was not forced. It happened naturally, guided by temperature and light. The long house did not fight the night, it anticipated it. Every feature of the structure reflected long familiarity with winter. Doors were low, requiring anyone who entered or left to bend, reducing the rush of cold air inside. Openings were few and small. There was no expectation of brightness. Firelight was enough. Darkness was not feared, it was managed. People moved within the space almost without looking, guided by memory and by the arrangement that never changed. The hearth was always in the same place. The platforms lined the walls as they always had. Storage rested beneath the platforms, out of the coldest air. Tools hung where hands expected them to be. In low light, predictability mattered more than visibility. As the evening deepened, the longhouse felt less like a building and more like a body. Warmth pulsed gently from the fire, heat rose from the animals. The walls slowed the cold. The roof carried away smoke. The floor absorbed what it could. Everything worked together, not efficiently in an engineered sense, but reliably in a way that could be trusted through long nights. A person sitting still could feel the longhouse working, the warmth at their back if they leaned toward the fire, the coolness at their feet if they sat too close to the edge of the platform, the slight draft if the door had been opened recently, the steadier air when it had been closed for a while. These sensations were constant, and over time they became familiar, even reassuring. The longhouse did not promise comfort, it promised continuity, and that promise shaped how people used it as night approached. The fire was never alone in its work. Even when the flames were low, even when the coals glowed faintly beneath ash, warmth moved through the longhouse from more than one source. It moved from bodies pressed close together. It moved from animals breathing steadily in the dimness beyond the partition. It moved slowly, quietly, without asking attention. The animals were not brought inside as a gesture of kindness. They were brought inside because winter made separation impractical. Outside, the cold would have taken them. Inside, their presence became part of the household's thermal balance. Their bodies produced heat continuously, without fuel, without tending. A cow's warmth was not dramatic, but it was persistent. Over hours, it accumulated. The partition between people and animals was low and open at the top. It did not seal the two spaces apart. Air passed freely over it. Warmth rose from the animals' bodies and drifted into the human living area, mixing with heat from the hearth. This circulation was slow and steady, like breathing. It did not create gusts or drafts. It created a shared interior climate. The animals settled early. Their routines were simpler than the humans, governed by feeding and rest. Once fed, they lay down, heavy bodies sinking into straw. Their breathing deepened. The sound was low and rhythmic, almost like distant surf. In the quiet of evening, it was easy to hear and easy to grow accustomed to. This sound mattered. It was a sign of stability. Animals that were breathing evenly were animals that were warm enough, calm enough, alive. Their presence confirmed that the system was holding. The fire responded to this shared warmth. It did not have to work as hard as it would have in an empty building. Fuel burned more slowly. Coals lasted longer. The person tending the hearth noticed these differences, even if they did not articulate them. They adjusted fuel accordingly, placing pieces more sparsely, trusting the combined heat of bodies and animals to carry the space through the night. Firelight flickered across the walls, catching on textures, packed earth, woven cloth, darkened wood. The light was not bright enough to reveal details far away, but it was enough to make the immediate space feel present. Faces glowed briefly when someone leaned forward. Hands were outlined as they passed over the coals. Shadows moved gently, never sharply, because the flames themselves were kept low. The smell of the fire was constant, a blend of fuel and smoke and old residue. It clung to hair and clothing, it soaked into fabric. It was not noticed unless it was absent. Smoke gathered near the roof where it belonged, leaving the air lower down, clearer, easier to breathe. The roof openings allowed smoke to escape gradually, without drawing too much heat with it. People arranged themselves instinctively. Those who felt colder moved closer to the hearth. Those who were warmer took positions farther back. Children were placed where the warmth was most reliable. The elderly settled where drafts were least likely. No one needed to negotiate these positions. They were understood. The fire was fed again, lightly, a piece placed here, another there, leaving space between. The flames responded with a quiet increase, then settled back. The sound of burning was steady, not sharp. Crackles were soft, infrequent. The goal was not light or spectacle, it was duration. The animals shifted occasionally. A hoof scraped, straw rustled. A body rolled slightly, redistributing weight. Each movement released a small pulse of warmth. Over time, these pulses blended into a background that filled the longhouse without drawing attention to itself. Shared warmth created shared rhythms. Breathing slowed together, movements became smaller. Speech, when it happened, was brief and low. There was no need to fill the space with words. The fire and the animals already filled it with presence. As evening deepened into night, the combined heat reached a stable balance, not warm, not cold, but survivable. The kind of temperature that allowed bodies to relax without losing vigilance, the kind that could be held if people stayed still, conserved energy, trusted the system they had built. The long house did not isolate people from winter, it moderated it. Cold remained just beyond the walls, pressing in patiently. Inside, warmth existed in pockets, sustained by cooperation between fire and fuel, between people and animals, between structure and habit. This cooperation was quiet. It did not require attention once established. It allowed the household to settle into the night without struggle, carried by systems that had been refined over many winters. Night did not arrive with a clear boundary. It crept in, deepening the shadows that were already present, turning dimness into darkness without asking permission. The longhouse responded by growing smaller in use, its active space drawing inward around the hearth. Movement slowed. Tasks that remained were repetitive and gentle. A bowl was rinsed and set aside. A tool was returned to its place. Bedding was adjusted once more, a corner pulled higher, a fold smoothed flat. These actions were not hurried. There was no advantage to speed now. What mattered was thoroughness. People began to sit rather than stand. Standing exposed more of the body to cooler air. Sitting conserved heat. Sitting allowed muscles to relax. Eventually, sitting gave way to lying down, bodies arranging themselves along the platforms in patterns that had repeated countless times before. Sleep did not come immediately. It was approached gradually. Someone stretched their legs, feeling stiffness ease slowly. Another pulled the fur closer around their shoulders, tucking it beneath their chin. A child shifted and was gently repositioned without waking. Hands found familiar places on a blanket edge, on a knee against another person's back. Contact mattered, Even light contact reduced heat loss. The fire was checked again for the last time before full rest. The coals were examined, not by sight alone, but by feel. A hand hovered close enough to sense the heat. The fuel remaining was judged. A small addition was made, chosen for how slowly it would burn. The firekeeper watched until the flame settled, then leaned back, satisfied. Smoke continued its slow rise. The air remained stable. The animals were quiet now, their breathing deep and regular. The sound blended with the faint crackle of the hearth, creating a layered background that did not demand attention. The longhouse felt enclosed, protective. The walls held steady against the cold outside. Wind brushed past without finding purchase. Snow pressed and drifted but did not intrude. Inside, warmth held. Breathing slowed across the space. Conversations ended not with a decision, but with fading interest. One voice trailed off. Another did not respond. Silence spread, not sudden, but incremental. Eyes closed. Opened briefly, closed again. Sleep approached in waves. Light sleep first, then deeper rest. The fire continued its quiet work. The animals continued theirs. The long house remained awake even as the people within it drifted. Time shifted. It was no longer measured by light or activity, but by internal rhythms, breath, heat, the slow consumption of fuel. Outside, winter continued its patient waiting. Inside, the household rested within the narrow margin it had created, held together by earth, fire, bodies, and habit, as the long night moved forward without ceremony. Sleep in the longhouse did not belong to one person at a time, it belonged to the group, unfolding across the space in a shared rhythm. Bodies lay close enough to feel one another's presence without effort. A shoulder pressed gently against another shoulder. A foot brushed a calf. These points of contact were not arranged with care. They emerged naturally as people settled into the limited space where warmth held most reliably. The sleeping platforms ran along the walls, raised just enough to lift bodies above the coldest air. They were wide, built to accommodate more than one person at a time. Furs and blankets layered the surface, each layer trapping a thin pocket of air. The weight of bodies pressed those layers together, shaping them into something that fit the group rather than any individual. People lay on their sides or backs, knees drawn slightly upward, arms folded close to the chest. These postures were not chosen consciously, they were remembered by the body, refined by long winters. Curled positions reduced exposed surface area. They kept warmth close to the core. Even sleep had learned efficiency. Breathing patterns began to align. At first, breaths were uneven, one deep, one shallow, another interrupted by a quiet sigh. Over time, they slowed and softened. The sound of breathing merged with the low background of the longhouse, the fire's faint crackle, the animals' steady exhalations, the distant hush of wind moving past thick walls. Children slept more deeply. Their small bodies lost heat quickly, but they also surrendered to rest without resistance. An adult shifted occasionally to draw fur higher over a child's shoulder, then settled again without fully waking. These movements were practiced, precise, done in half sleep. Adults rested more lightly, not from anxiety but from habit. The night required awareness even in rest, a change in the fire's sound, a sudden draft, an animal stirring sharply. Any of these could pull someone closer to waking. Sleep was layered, like the bedding, light sleep on top, deeper rest beneath, all of it responsive. The fire continued its quiet burn. Coals glowed beneath ash, releasing heat slowly. The light they cast was minimal, just enough to give the interior a faint, warm pulse. Shadows barely moved. The roof timbers disappeared into darkness above, leaving the inhabited space defined by warmth rather than sight. The animals slept too, their bodies pressed into straw, warmth pooling around them. Occasionally one shifted, releasing a small cloud of heat that drifted upward. The sound of a large animal's breath was low and reassuring. It filled the space without demanding attention, a reminder that the system extended beyond human effort. No one expected perfect stillness. Small noises were part of sleep. A blanket rustled. Someone cleared their throat softly. A sleeper adjusted position, the platform creaking faintly beneath the shift. These sounds did not disturb, they confirmed presence. Outside, the night pressed on. Snow settled. Wind traced familiar paths along the longhouse's exterior, testing corners and seams. The walls answered with their thickness. Inside, the cold remained present but distant, slowed by earth and habit. Sleep deepened in stages. Muscles loosened. Breaths lengthened. Awareness narrowed to the most basic sensations: warmth against skin, steady pressure of the surface beneath, the rhythm of shared breathing. Time lost its usual markers. There was no light to measure it, no tasks to divide it. There was only rest moving gradually toward its deeper center. The night stretched on without interruption. There was no moment when it felt halfway done. Darkness remained complete, unbroken by any hint of dawn. The longhouse existed as a small island of moderated warmth in a wider, colder world that continued its slow, patient motion. At some point, a sleeper stirred enough to become aware of the fire again. Not fully awake, but alert in the way the body becomes when its senses change. The crackle had softened. The heat felt less immediate. A hand reached out, hovering toward the hearth, filling the air. Warmth was still there, but thinner. The person rose carefully, movements practiced enough to avoid waking others. They stepped down from the platform, feet finding the layered floor coverings without looking. The air near the ground was colder, pulling heat quickly from ankles and calves. They crouched near the hearth, breath visible for a moment before blending into the smoky dimness. Ash was shifted gently. Coals brightened in response, a deeper red emerging. A small piece of fuel was added, chosen for its density and slow burn. The person waited, watching until the flame caught, then retreated, satisfied. The entire act took only a few minutes. It was not an interruption, it was part of the night's rhythm. Returning to the platform, the sleeper eased back into place. A fur was drawn up. Contact with another body restored warmth quickly. Sleep resumed without ceremony. Elsewhere in the longhouse, someone turned over, adjusting to the subtle change in temperature. The animals breathed on, unaffected. The fire settled again into its quiet work. Hours passed without being counted. The cold outside intensified as it often did in the deepest part of night. The difference was felt inside as a gentle pressure, a reminder of what lay beyond the walls. The longhouse responded by holding its heat closer. Drafts slowed, air grew stiller. The interior became a pocket of relative stability. Breathing deepened across the platforms. Sleep reached its heavier stages. Dreams, if they came, were simple and fragmented, shaped by familiar sensations rather than images. The sound of the fire became part of those dreams. So did the animals' breathing. The mind did not need to interpret these sounds. It accepted them as background, as constant as the body's own heartbeat. Occasionally, a sleeper shifted and brushed against another. Neither fully woke. The contact registered briefly, then faded back into warmth. The group remained intact, bodies arranged in a way that minimized heat loss without conscious planning. The fire burned lower again, not dangerously low, but enough to require attention before dawn. The coals retained their heat beneath ash, insulated by their own residue. This insulation was intentional. It slowed the burn, preserved energy. Fire, like everything else in winter, was managed for duration. The animals stirred slightly as the cold outside deepened. One rose briefly, stamping a hoof to settle straw, then lay down again. The movement released another wave of warmth. The longhouse absorbed it, distributing it slowly through the shared air. Time moved in this manner, small adjustments, long stillness, repeated without urgency. Sleep was not total unconsciousness, it was a negotiated state responsive to the environment, balanced between rest and readiness. The body learned this balance over years, adapting to nights that demanded both. The longhouse remained steady, its structure doing what it had always done, slowing the cold, holding heat, allowing life to pause without stopping entirely. The cold reached its deepest point before morning. There was no visible sign of this shift. Darkness remained absolute. The change was felt instead in the way air pressed slightly harder against skin, in the way warmth retreated more quickly when a blanket shifted. Even inside the long house, the cold announced itself through sensation rather than sight. Sleep grew lighter for some. Bodies that had rested deeply now hovered closer to waking. A hand emerged from beneath a fur, then retreated again. A knee drew closer to the chest. These adjustments were small instinctive responses to the narrowing margin of warmth. The fire was quieter now. Coals glowed faintly, their heat still present but less assertive. Someone woke enough to notice. They did not rise immediately. They waited, gauging whether the fire would hold until light. This judgment was learned through experience. Rising too often wasted energy. Waiting too long risked cold. After a few breaths, the decision was made. The sleeper moved again, careful, economical. Ash shifted. A final piece of fuel was placed, chosen for its ability to burn through the last hours of night. The flame caught slowly, then steadied. Heat thickened the air around the hearth just enough. Returning to rest, the person felt the difference immediately. Warmth spread across their side, muscles eased, sleep reclaimed its space. Across the longhouse, others adjusted unconsciously to the renewed heat. Breathing synchronized again. The animals remained calm, their own warmth unchanged by the hour. Outside, the world remained frozen. Snow held its shape, wind softened slightly, then returned. The longhouse did not respond visibly. It simply continued to exist, doing its quiet work. The moments before dawn were often the hardest. Bodies were tired. Fuel had been consumed steadily through the night. The cold had accumulated. Yet these moments were also familiar. They arrived every day in winter, predictable in their difficulty. Inside, the group endured them together, not through effort, but through arrangement. Bodies close, heat shared, fire maintained just enough, animals breathing steadily. Eventually, without announcement, the night began to loosen its hold, not with light, but with a subtle change in air. a faint easing that the body noticed before the eyes could. Sleep lightened further. Someone sighed and stretched slightly, already anticipating the return of tasks and motion. The longhouse held this final quiet stretch, poised between night and morning, maintaining its balance as it had for countless winters before, without marking the transition as an ending, only as another small shift in the ongoing rhythm of cold, warmth, rest, and wakefulness. Morning does not arrive all at once. It begins as a loosening, almost imperceptible. The long house does not brighten yet. The walls do not change color. Darkness still fills the space between the roof posts and settles low along the packed earth floor. But something shifts all the same. The cold that pressed inward through the night eases its grip, not retreating, only relaxing enough to be noticed by bodies that have learned to listen closely. Breathing changes first. Sleep becomes lighter, thinner, like a layer of frost beginning to soften before it disappears. A sleeper exhales more fully. Another turns slightly, adjusting a blanket that has slipped during the night. A child stirs and settles again, comforted by the familiar warmth beside them. These movements are slow, unhurried, the kind that belong to the edge of waking rather than its center. The fire remains low, its work nearly finished for the night. Coals glow faintly beneath ash, holding just enough heat to bridge the final stretch of darkness. The warmth they release is subtle now, but it spreads where it is needed, reaching the nearest bodies, thickening the air by degrees. No one rushes to build the fire higher yet. There is time. The animals breathe on, steady and untroubled. Their warmth has not changed. A cow shifts its weight, straw rustling softly. The sound moves through the longhouse without breaking the calm. It belongs here, part of the same rhythm that has carried the night from evening into its final hours. Outside, the world remains quiet. Snow holds its shape. Wind moves lightly, then pauses. The sky begins its slow transition long before light appears, though this cannot be seen from inside. The land prepares itself without ceremony, just as it always does. Inside, the long house still feels enclosed, protective. The walls continue to do their work, holding back the cold, holding together what warmth remains. The roof carries away the last thin traces of smoke. The floor absorbs footsteps that have not yet been taken. People wake in stages. One opens their eyes and closes them again, lingering in the warmth that has been carefully preserved through the night. Another stretches an arm, then draws it back beneath a fur. Muscles respond slowly, stiff but willing. The body remembers where it is and what comes next. No one speaks yet. Morning in winter does not invite conversation, it invites assessment. A person listens to the fire, to the animals, to their own breathing. They note how the cold feels against exposed skin, how much warmth remains in the space, how ready the body feels to move. These judgments happen quietly, without words. Eventually, someone sits up. The movement creates a small ripple through the stillness. A platform creaks softly. Air shifts. Cold brushes against a cheek, sharper now that the body is upright. The person pauses, letting their senses adjust, then lowers their feet carefully, finding the layered coverings on the floor. They move toward the hearth, hands already reaching out to the faint warmth. Ash is stirred once more. Coals brighten, responding as they always do. A new piece of fuel is placed, chosen not for speed but for steadiness. The fire answers slowly, flame growing just enough to mark the beginning of a new cycle. Others follow. Sleep gives way to waking not as a break but as a continuation. Bodies sit up, blankets are folded back, furs are shaken gently, releasing air and warmth. Children are guided upright, blinking, still wrapped in sleep. The long house begins to expand again, its active space moving outward from the hearth as light, real light, waits just beyond the door. The night has done its work. It has passed without crisis, without interruption, carried by small actions repeated at the right moments. Heat has been shared, cold has been managed, rest has been taken where it could be found. Nothing has been conquered, nothing has been escaped. The night has simply been lived through. Soon the door will open. Cold air will enter briefly, sharp and honest. Pale daylight will spill across the floor. The day's work will begin again, shaped by the same careful attention that guided the night. Fuel will be gathered, food will be prepared, bodies will move, conserving energy, preparing once more for the darkness that will return as it always does. But for now, there is this moment. The fire strengthens slightly. The longhouse holds steady. Warmth gathers close. The last threads of sleep loosen and drift away, leaving behind a quiet readiness for what comes next. If you're listening from somewhere warm and safe, you might let yourself rest a little longer here in this slow transition between night and morning. And if you'd like, you can leave a thought below or return again for another night like this. For now, the longhouse breathes, the winter waits, and the day begins gently without hurry.